At long last, Five Nights at Freddy's has hit theaters. As someone who has been waiting for this day since 2015, this was by far the media release I was most excited for this year. That's pretty impressive considering I was also really looking forward to these three things. But now that it's out and I've seen it a couple times, was it worth the wait? Sorta? Don't get me wrong, my expectations for this movie were not very high, despite how excited I was. The trailer seemed really cliche, and the fact that it was produced by Blumhouse was an even bigger red flag. For those of you who don't know, Blumhouse is a production studio founded by this guy. He has discovered an infinite money glitch in real life. Basically, if you throw a few $1,000,000 at every person who says they want to make a horror movie, every once in a while you'll end up finding something that makes an absurd amount of profit. That's not a guaranteed death knell for every movie from them. In fact, this strategy has led to a couple really great movies, some that I find enjoyable, but also a lot of pure garbage. And now that I've seen it, I think this movie is perfectly fine. But the question remains, why? What went wrong here, but also what went right? Let's find out. And spoilers ahead, you've been warned. First, let's give a general overview of the plot. Five Nights at Freddy's is the story of Mike Schmidt, recently unemployed, who needs a job to prove he's reliable enough to maintain custody of his younger sister, Abby. He talks to a career counselor, played by the always wonderful Matthew Lillard. Unfortunately, due to his bad track record, he doesn't have anything for him. Until he notices his last name. He doesn't read it out loud, but it has a clear effect on him. His whole demeanor changes, and he has a job for Mike. He offers him a security job with terrible pay and terrible hours. Mike initially declines, but upon realizing that he's faced with an upcoming custody battle, he reluctantly takes the job. The career counselor then explains the job as he enters the abandoned building. On his first night, nothing of interest happens. The second night is much the same as the first. Throughout every time he sleeps, we see a sequence of Mike as a child watching his brother get kidnapped. Except this time on night 2, 5 children are there. They have what I think might just be the lamest jump scare in any horror movie with a budget this size, and Mike wakes up to discover there's a cop at the front door. He lets her inside, and we are finally introduced to the animatronics. Shortly after, we are treated to a MatPat jump scare.
Some people say that, but it's just a theory.
Are you being paid by the word, or could we have a minute?
Back in 2014, when this franchise first took off, I was a pretty big game theory fan. So it was genuinely nice to see him in this movie, and I completely lost my mind at the fact that they shoehorned in his catchphrase. The inclusion was forced, but I loved it. Once MatPat leaves, Mike's evil aunt and Abby's babysitter hatch a plan to break into Freddy's to get him fired. It doesn't work, and in fact, they get attacked by the animatronics. One gets killed by the cupcake in the kitchen, one by Bonnie in the closet, one by Foxy in the hallway, and one gets bitten in half by Freddy. Yes, in half. It was really funny. When it comes time for him to go to work, he finds out his babysitter isn't returning his calls. I wonder why. As a result, Mike is forced to bring Abby, and as phone guy puts it,
things are getting real tonight.
Mike finally makes some headway with the kids in his dream, and meanwhile Abby confronts the animatronics and gets attacked. With tickles. As it turns out, the animatronics love kids. She makes friends with them. Mike realizes that they could have the key to finding his brother, and they're willing to cooperate with Abby, so he brings her back for night 4. Out of absolutely nowhere, we are blindsided with a montage of Mike, the cop, the animatronics, and Abby building a fort big enough to fit everyone inside. It's incredibly cheesy, and it genuinely gave me tonal whiplash. Then while Bonnie is playing the guitar, Abby tries strumming it and gets electrocuted. As a result, the cop threatens to shoot Mike if Abby is brought back. On the 5th night at Freddy's, Mike comes back alone, but then Golden Freddy rolls up to his house, kills the evil ants, and then he and Abby take a taxi ride back to Freddy's. The audience clued me into the fact that this is another YouTuber cameo, and I'm glad it's there for people who know who he is. Unfortunately for me though, I didn't know who it was, and despite getting me to chuckle, this scene felt really out of place. At least now I know why it was there. Finally though, we get to the real action. Mike wakes up in a saw trap but manages to escape, and he meets up with the cop who explains that she's actually the daughter of William Afton, who is the owner of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and a serial killer. Together they fight back against the animatronics to save Abby, and are almost successful until a new challenger approaches. This yellow rabbit is immune to tasers, can move much more freely than the other animatronics, and even talks. That's because this is no animatronic, but rather William Afton in the flesh. And he's ready to kill Mike. He takes off his mask and surprise! It's Matthew Lillard. He sells the performance really well here. He's not as energetic as some of his other roles, but I also think it being slightly more muted makes sense. He's in the middle of a monologue before he gets shot by his daughter. In response, he stabs her. Now, how do Mike and Abby overcome this monstrous threat? By drawing a picture, of course! Throughout the entire movie, they've been setting up this theme of kids learning how to communicate through pictures. It's at the beginning when a school psychologist explains that Abby cares about Mike. It shows up again when the animatronics become friends with Abby, and when Abby is angry with Mike, she scribbles him out of pictures. Naturally, she saves the day by drawing a picture. You see, the animatronics have been tricked into thinking Afton is their friend, but Abby drawing a picture is enough to convince them otherwise. The cupcake scores another kill by activating the spring locks in Afton's suit, causing him to collapse to the floor. They get the cop, who is still alive, to a hospital and the day is saved. Everyone gets to go home, except Afton, who is left in the kitchen by the animatronics. So, yeah, the plot is really straightforward and simple, and very dumb, which isn't a bad thing. I can ignore the fact that, like a lot of horror movies, this movie is filled absolutely to the brim with filler. It's not unwatchable, and I don't find it boring, but there is a lot of it. That didn't ruin my experience, though. In fact, there's a lot of elements I really like. This might be a hot take, but I think the animatronics being friendly towards Abby is a cool idea. I don't know if we needed an entire 80s pop montage, but them getting along was fun. I also think that most of the characters felt pretty believable throughout. Most of the acting was good, with Lillard being a particular standout. Even the child acting was better than most horror movies, with a couple exceptions that probably could have used another take. That being said, the main driving factor for our characters is basically the same as Lilo and Stitch. The older sibling with a knack for getting fired has to take their younger sister to work with them or face losing custody of the one family member they have left. It's the exact same as Lilo and Stitch. And I totally get it. If you're gonna steal from a Disney movie, you might as well steal from one of the best. But where I think these two differ is that Lilo and Stitch gives you so much development of the relationship between these two siblings, both dealing with the grief of losing their family separately. And when they finally break down each other's walls and connect, the raw emotion is genuinely heartwarming and shocking. Five Nights at Freddy's, meanwhile, doesn't really do that. Mike is so obsessed with figuring out what happened to his brother that the movie spends a majority of its time on that. There's no need to develop the relationship between these two characters like there is in Lilo and Stitch. I'm genuinely serious about this, by the way. I'm not saying it has to be the exact same, but I think that's why this was so effective, and this wasn't. This might be a goofy comparison, and granted, that's fair, but it's all I could think about whenever there were scenes connecting these two. I appreciate that the characters are motivated by each other, and I wouldn't want that dynamic changed, but it just didn't feel developed enough. Now, one potential counter to this is the idea that this is a horror movie, you can't spend all your time developing characters, they're more focused on the scares. And I disagree for two reasons. One, Lilo and Stitch managed to have all these great moments while still being a hilarious comedy. And two, it's not scary. I know horror is subjective and everything, and the games aren't that scary either, but looking back on the original game, it's actually pretty smart in design. It thrusts you into the deep end, with a guy talking on the phone as your only way of learning the rules. You can't move, and it's made clear that power is an issue. Naturally, any person in this situation is going to want one thing: information. But in order to get information, you have to expend valuable power. This is a core juxtaposition of the original game. At first, it seems like you have to trade safety for information. You can play it safe and only check the cameras or lights occasionally, not knowing where the danger is or how fast it's approaching. Or you can do the opposite, spending a lot of time on the cameras, knowing where everyone is and how much danger you're in, but this will cost power, and if you're not careful, get you killed. It might be hard to remember this before it became a massive franchise, but this simple concept was great at building tension. The dread of feeling helpless, the tension as Bonnie camps outside your door for 3 hours, or the first time you catch a glimpse of Foxy sprinting down the hallway are all reasonably effective. Combine that with the game's outdated style feeling intentionally unsettling, and you have a recipe for success. I'm not gonna lie and say that this is anything remotely scary, but it's great at building tension, and the jump scares are an effective way to release that tension. The audio design, atmosphere, and limited scope are all working against you to make you panic, and I think it does a really good job at it. This becomes way less important as the games went on, and by the time the movie came out, it was pretty much gone. So when the franchise got translated into a movie, they clearly had a different idea in mind. That's fine, but the ideas they did have were not great. I'm someone who's really experienced with the horror genre, and Five Nights at Freddy's as a whole. This movie unfortunately does not cater to the horror fan in me. It's directed at being baby's first horror movie, and that's totally respectable. It's full of relatively safe, mild PG-13 scares that check all the boxes. There's random characters that exist only to be fodder for the killers, there's needless jump scares and loud audio stings, and the kills are all relatively kid-friendly. It was effective for that demographic though, as the kids in front of me jumped so hard they flung popcorn everywhere a couple times, but for me it felt uninspired and boring. I wouldn't have minded as much if the story had some more to it, but instead we spend an absurdly long amount of time watching Mike's dreams, with relatively little being added each time. These two options unfortunately made the second time I watched this far less engaging than the first. I revisited it hoping to uncover hidden details, and while there certainly are Easter eggs, I didn't notice that many more the second time around. I'm sure there's some I don't even have a chance of knowing due to me losing interest in the lore of the series after Ultimate Custom Night, and never reading the books, but it all felt pretty straightforward. Not bad, just disappointing. I also felt like there were a couple of missed opportunities, like a power outage sequence, or Freddy's music box song being used even once. It was all over the trailer, so naturally I expected it to be in the movie, but it wasn't. I got bamboozled again, just like Rise of Skywalker using Duel of the Fates in its trailers. Another major criticism I had is that this movie treated certain moments as if they were way more important than they actually are. Remember how I said Afton avoided saying Mike's last name out loud and his demeanor changed? Well, that's because he's actually the one that took Mike's brother and killed him. He recognized Mike's last name and immediately wanted Michael dead, and that's why he gave him the job. That's all well and good, but the movie treated Michael's last name like some big reveal. I guess this makes sense considering that in the games the most important Michael is Michael Afton, William's son. But it still felt really weird, because there were like 5 moments where it felt like they should have said his last name, but they didn't, just so Afton could say it at the end as if it were some huge revelation. They also had him say, "I always come back," before putting on the mask and dying, which felt equally forced and hilarious. I don't think it earned the right to say that considering he had like 5 minutes of screen time, but oh well. With that in mind, this is the part where I have to recommend anyone who is not a Five Nights at Freddy's fan and over the age of 16 to consider skipping this movie. You won't get much out of it unless you go with a fan. That being said though, what if you are a fan? You'll probably have a blast. I know I've been really harsh on this movie so far, so let's fix that just a little bit. This movie is genuinely pretty funny. There's a lot of moments that made me laugh out loud, like the aforementioned Matt Pat jump scare and the taxi scene. But there's also a lot of fun, goofy moments like when Mike figures out the children in his dreams are possessing the animatronics, Abby says, "Of course they are, that's how they make the robots move." Which I felt like was a good jab at the horror cliche of characters freaking out and going, "This isn't happening, this isn't real!" That's not the point of the mystery here, and I appreciate the movie skipping that cliche. I also think that the visual design is absolutely top-notch. I've heard criticism that the animatronics look too clean and shiny, which I agree with, but aside from having a few shots of some not-so-stellar effects, that's my only complaint. Freddy's looks absolutely fantastic. It perfectly captures the aesthetic of the games, is completely filled to the brim with Easter eggs, and is a genuinely delightful setting. The whole movie has a lot of effort put into it when it comes to visual design. Characters can be seen wearing shirts that reference important secrets in the games, there's an ice cream stand with this thing as its logo, and there's a ton of other great examples. This side of things is where fans of the series will really get their mileage. There's plenty of times I was tempted to do this, and that's a good thing. I know it can be seen as cheap and hollow, and I've certainly used this criticism against other things, but honestly it feels less disingenuous here, especially considering that background details and obscure Easter eggs are basically this franchise's biggest staple. With all that said, it's probably one of the better video game adaptations out there. It's full of fan service and will only be loved by fans of the games, or more likely Markiplier's videos on the games, but it's not full of moments that only make sense if you're familiar with the original. To wrap up this discussion, I think this movie has its flaws, and it was certainly made for a younger demographic, but if it had come out 9 years ago, I would have loved it. I might be a little too kind to it, but I also can't be mad at something I genuinely had a lot of fun with. And for that reason, I'm going to give this movie a 6 out of 10. I would have personally enjoyed it more if it was a complete disaster, but it wasn't. It was a perfectly serviceable tween horror movie that kids are gonna love, and I still got enough of it to say I had fun. A sequel is probably on the way, and if it is, I hope they give people like me a little more to hold on to now that we've established the characters and setting. I've talked this movie over with a few people who care about the series way more than I do. They had similar criticisms to me, but they seem to enjoy it as much as or more than I did. I think that's the most important thing with this movie. I had a good time, and I thought it was worth seeing in theaters. But for the real fans, the people who stuck with the series past Ultimate Custom Night and spent their time dissecting and understanding the lore, this movie is for them. I couldn't be happier for them, and I think this is the biggest reason why the Rotten Tomatoes score difference is so high. I can set my gripes aside and let people have fun, because it's genuinely really cool to see this simple game turn into a massive franchise that is seeing a lot of success on the big screen. If this franchise continues, I'll be there too. These games had a big impact on me, and it feels cathartic to see it get a shot at the big time. I hope there's a new movie soon with more details, more scares, and more Matthew Lillard. If you're a fan, go see this movie. Whether you're a casual fan like myself, or you're dedicated enough to bring a Foxy plush, like the person sitting next to my friend and I, then there's something for you to enjoy, I promise. That being said, that's basically all I have to say. I know this review didn't go super in-depth, but I just wanted to share my thoughts. As always, if you agreed or disagreed with what I had to say, please comment. I love discussing movies with people, and I want to hear what you have to say. If you liked the video, consider checking out some of my other videos, or just leave a like on this one. If you want to see more like this, feel free to subscribe. I appreciate you making it this far, so comment your favorite animatronic and I'll give it a heart. Thanks for watching.
Was that the bite of 80?